Hi, I'm Adam from the QI team, and this is the third of our quality improvement mini modules. And today we're going to be looking at stakeholder engagement, which is a key part of the quality improvement process. So, much like the plants that we have growing here in our wellbeing garden at EDGH, relationships with stakeholders need to be nurtured and looked after over the course of a project, not just at the initial start out. Also, like these plants, some stakeholders might be a little bit spiky to begin with, but eventually can blossom into beautiful flowers. And others, like these shrubs, kind of look after themselves with a little bit of watering and tending now and then. So I hope that with the tools that I'm going to go through in this unit, you can successfully manage your stakeholder engagement process, and your projects will continue to grow into the future and come up smelling of roses. So let's start by looking at how stakeholder engagement is relevant at each stage of a project. The first part of an improvement project is what we call scoping. It's very important to engage with stakeholders at this point because they're the people who are going to understand what the problems are, what the opportunities might be, and where the best place to begin the project could be. After that, we usually move on to thinking about how we're going to measure improvement and establishing a baseline from which we can improve. But taking measurements often involves more people than you might anticipate who need to be involved in gathering those measurements or who have responsibility for that data. Also, we often want to gather information directly from the people affected by a change, what we would call qualitative data. Next, we would move into the stage of thinking about what the changes are that we think we might want to test and how we'd go about delivering those changes. So at this point, it's really important to get everyone together to make sure we've got an exhaustive list of all the things that might affect our problem that we're trying to improve. And you can only do that by bringing together a range of people. Now we would move into the phase where we're actually testing changes and looking at the results. And again, it's really important to continue engaging with the people involved in delivering that work to see what do they feel went well, do they have any comments, is there anything that didn't show up in the data that they need to point out. So as you implement those PDSA cycles, you're continuously checking in with the project team to gather any comments, feedback or observations that might help inform what you do next. And finally, as we reach the point where our improvements might have become business as usual, we need to keep having those conversations to ensure that they remain sustainable and also to make sure that we spread the learning from that project across the organisation. So now let's look at a framework for how we might plan that process. First, we need to identify the people who might be stakeholders in the change that we're delivering. At this point, the important thing is quantity, and we want to generate as many ideas as possible of people who may be affected by our change and are therefore stakeholders. So we bring together the project team and carry out a brainstorming session to come up with a very big list of potential stakeholders. Next, we need to think about how we prioritise those stakeholders so that we can use the time and resources that we have available for engagement work as effectively as possible. Often, two of the key things that we would think about are how much that stakeholder might be affected by the change that we're going to implement, but also how much influence they might have over the likely success of the project. Now that we've decided with whom we want to focus our engagement efforts, we need to have a think about how receptive those people or teams are to the change that's being proposed. Because whether somebody is already on board with the idea that we're proposing, or if they're actually very resistant to it, will make a big difference to how we might want to approach starting the engagement conversation with them. And this is where we can start to put together a plan of how to communicate with each of these stakeholders. And this can vary greatly depending on the working pattern of that individual, their preferences for the amount of information they want to receive, and whether they want, for example, to meet face-to-face or simply to receive regular update reports and data. Now let's look at some general principles for building engagement and how you can increase the likelihood that a lot of people get on board with your change initiative. First of all, people need a really clear idea of why we're doing this. What's the end objective and what evidence is there that this change is a good idea? What might seem like obviously a good idea to you could evoke much more skepticism or anxiety in somebody who's had different experiences. People don't want to have their time wasted on improvement initiatives that could potentially be quite disruptive and don't always achieve that much. So at this point, it can be very helpful to give a clear plan detailing realistic and achievable steps that can be taken towards the overall improvement aim, and also when you might be likely to see some measurable results. This particularly applies to individuals or teams who are going to have a key influence over the likely success of the project but who aren't engaged. We need to think carefully about what we need to do to help get them on board. A popular way of achieving engagement within a team is to assign one individual to be a champion for that particular change. However, it's important that that person is somebody who is able to commit time and energy and who is motivated about that particular issue. Otherwise, they'll be a champion in name only. An effective champion might be someone who has a specialist interest in the area of change and therefore can act to role model best practice for others within the team. Although it's never possible to make contact with absolutely everyone affected by a change, a key principle is not to overlook people who might be more difficult to make contact with. A key group being patients, who may not be as accessible as fellow staff, but are crucial in the stakeholder engagement process. A common mistake is to develop what we think is a persuasive argument in the form of perhaps a presentation or a document, and then presenting it to all of our stakeholders in the same format. This means that we're making assumptions about the priorities of those individuals. Quite often, when we don't tailor our message to be relevant to the concerns of each individual or group, they won't pay very much attention to it. The alternative to this approach is to start the process by asking more questions than giving information. And by doing this, you can develop an understanding of what's most important and what the primary concerns of each individual stakeholder are. This in turn allows us to begin framing our message in a way that's likely to be persuasive based on what we know our stakeholders are concerned about. So for example, for some groups of staff, and this is particularly true of doctors, the most important thing is to know that our change is based on good quality scientific evidence. For a lot of NHS staff, knowing that the proposed change is going to have a direct benefit for patients and isn't just for the benefit of the organisation is a very important factor. People are also often concerned that this proposed improvement might make their life more difficult. It's good to make an argument that this could simplify or make life easier on a day-to-day basis. We also know that making positive improvements to services can be something that builds morale and actually brings teams together. So it's worth making the point that quality improvement work is something that can support team engagement. So the key take-home message is that no matter what kind of improvement or change you're trying to engage people with, it's important to tailor not just the amount of engagement activity that you support them through, but also how that message is framed and communicating via channels that are appropriate for that particular stakeholder. So that was just a brief overview of the key principles of stakeholder engagement. We go into a lot more detail on our formal quality improvement training programs. You can also get started implementing some of the methods described in this module using the tools that are available on the NHS Improvement website, and these are shown on the screen now. As ever, the QI team are available to support with these methods if you want to get in touch. Our usual email address. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next module.